For a long time, the palace whispered about tensions, but no one imagined it would reach this point. A hidden scheme, a royal bloodline suddenly at risk, and a single palace guard, sworn to silence, trained to obey, forced to decide between loyalty to the crown and loyalty to the truth. Because when he uncovered what Camilla was planning behind those velvet-draped corridors, he realized something chilling. If he stayed quiet, the future of the monarchy might collapse overnight. So he stepped forward and changed everything. Before we dive deeper, if you enjoy unraveling real royal mysteries and the stories they try to bury, go ahead and tap like. It helps more people find these hidden narratives. And if you want more insider-style royal breakdowns, hit subscribe and share this with someone who loves a good palace twist. The morning the tension truly began, the palace looked deceptively calm. Soft winter light filtered across the courtyard, brushing the stone walls with a quiet glow. Tourists outside the gates pressed their faces against the bars, hoping for a glimpse of royalty. But inside, behind those velvet-draped halls and centuries-old portraits, a silent shift had started, one that only a handful of people noticed. He was one of them. Thomas Hale had served as a royal guard for 12 years. Loyal, precise, invisible when necessary. His job was to blend into the palace walls, to watch without speaking, to protect the bloodline without ever letting his emotions show. Most days were predictable, escorting the family, monitoring corridors, standing in stillness until his muscles ached. But lately, something in the air felt wrong. And the strange part? It all seemed to center around Camilla. It wasn't anything obvious at first. A few unusual meetings, staff being reassigned without explanation, members of her personal team entering areas they had no business being in, places only blood relatives were supposed to pass through. Thomas didn't want to jump to conclusions. Palace politics were always messy, and he had learned long ago that acting on rumor was a rookie mistake. But a guard doesn't ignore patterns. He watches, he listens, and Thomas listened better than most. The first spark of suspicion came during a late evening shift outside one of the private drawing rooms. Camilla's voice carried through the partially cracked door. He wasn't supposed to react, but her tone, sharp, frustrated, almost trembling, forced him to focus. "And I told you this is the only way. If they push me aside again, I won't stand for it." A man responded, voice low, urgent. Thomas couldn't catch the words. Then the door shut and silence returned. He didn't move, not even a breath too deep. Guards were trained to be statues. But inside, his instincts flickered awake. Only way to what? Pushed aside by whom? And why discuss it in a room meant only for senior bloodline councils? Hours later, after the shift ended, Thomas walked through the courtyard with one of the newer guards, Ellis. The younger man shrugged off the tension. "Probably another family argument," Ellis said, brushing it off. "They happen all the time." Thomas nodded, but something tugged at him. Royals argued, yes, but not like that, and not behind council doors. The following week, the tension thickened. He noticed documents being transported discreetly. Sealed folders with red tabs, marked only for Her Majesty's enclosure. But the address label didn't match Camilla's usual correspondence. It pointed to a restricted archive, one storing genealogical records, birth logs, and succession papers. Only the monarch, the Prince of Wales, and 2 archivists were allowed to access them. So why were Camilla's aides delivering files there? One afternoon, Thomas caught sight of Sarah Alding, one of Camilla's closest advisors, slipping into the archive chamber. She wasn't authorized. He checked the registry. No one had logged her entry. She was sneaking in under someone else's code. Thomas held his breath as she emerged minutes later, clutching a file tightly against her chest, her eyes darting down the hallway. He stepped back into the shadows so she wouldn't notice him. Just as she passed, he heard her mutter under her breath, "Good. This is exactly what we needed." Needed for what? Every clue felt small on its own, but together, they painted a picture Thomas didn't like. And if palace history taught anything, it was this. The smallest cracks often led to the deepest fractures. That evening, he stayed late under the excuse of reviewing routine assignments. Really, he was keeping an eye on the service corridors, the route staff used to avoid public areas. Around 10:30 p.m., he spotted Camilla herself walking briskly through the back passageway, accompanied by 2 aides. No security escort. No notice. Odd. Very odd. He followed at a distance. They entered a private office, one that belonged to a former royal genealogist who had retired months earlier. It should have been locked. Yet Thomas heard the soft click of the door opening, then Camilla's voice. Everything depends on this. No mistakes. His pulse stirred. He leaned slightly closer, careful not to cast a shadow under the door. Another voice, male, crisp. Once the new documentation is finalized, no one will challenge it. They won't dare. New documentation? Challenge what? The idea hit him like cold water. Was this about the line of succession? He tried to steady his breathing. The palace had survived decades of disputes, rumors, and internal storms. But fiddling with the bloodline? That was the one line nobody crossed, not even royals themselves. Its protection was sacred. Tampering with it was unthinkable. Thomas backed away, not wanting to risk being discovered. But the weight of what he'd overheard stayed heavy on his shoulders. For the next few days, he monitored everything quietly. Camilla's patience grew thinner. Staff whispered about her nerves, her sudden mood swings, her demands to meet certain people without scheduling them through official channels. One guard mentioned she'd been asking about processes for amendment, though he didn't know what it meant. But the moment that truly shook Thomas came one afternoon near the private stairwell connecting the royal apartments. Voices carried again, hurried, worried, almost panicked. If William gets wind of this, he won't, Camilla snapped. Not unless someone talks. And no guard will risk their post over this. That stung him unexpectedly. She was relying on their silence, their obedience, their fear of losing their positions. She didn't know Thomas. He wasn't afraid of losing his job. He was afraid of losing the integrity of the crown he had pledged to serve. Still, he needed proof. Rumors meant nothing. Evidence meant everything. One evening, when most palace staff were gone, he quietly entered the genealogist's abandoned office. He didn't touch anything, just observed. A faint imprint on the desk. Dust disturbed only in certain areas. A drawer left slightly ajar. He felt something under the blotter, an indentation writing. Someone had pressed a pen so hard it left marks. He angled the desk lamp, revealing partial impressions. Amend, line, final by Thursday. His stomach tightened. Amend line, final by Thursday. This was no misunderstanding. Something serious, something dangerous was happening, and time was running out. Outside, footsteps approached. Thomas stepped into the corner, melting into the shadows. Sarah Alding entered, rummaging through the drawers. She muttered, "Where is it?" She said it was here. Then her phone rang. "It better be done tomorrow," she whispered fiercely. "If Charles signs this without knowing the full details, everything shifts." Charles, sign, shift. 3 words that snapped the last remaining thread of doubt. Thomas knew then that silence was no longer an option. Whatever Camilla was orchestrating, it wasn't harmless palace politics. It was bigger, deeper, and it threatened the very core of the royal bloodline. For the first time in his 12 years of service, Thomas Hale felt fear, not for himself, but for the future of the crown he had sworn to protect. And he realized something chilling. He might be the only one who knew enough to stop it. Thomas Hale woke the next morning with a feeling he hadn't experienced since his first year in service, a gnawing sense that every step he took was being watched. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct, an instinct sharpened by years of training, standing guard through crises, protests, family disputes, and unpredictable public appearances. His senses had saved lives more than once. Today, they were screaming at him to stay alert. The palace looked normal enough. Staff hurried through corridors carrying silver trays, fresh linens, and last-minute schedules. The florists were busy replacing arrangements in the main hall. A familiar smell of polished wood and old stone drifted through the air. Yet beneath all of it, Thomas felt an undercurrent. Something tight, tense, almost electric. People noticed him, too. Camilla's aides gave him longer looks than usual. One of them paused mid-step when she saw him, as if she hadn't expected him in that area. Another quickly ended a phone call and turned the other direction the moment Thomas approached. He didn't like this. He didn't like that they didn't like him, and he especially didn't like the thought that Camilla's circle somehow sensed he had seen more than he should. Midday came with a surprise announcement. All security staff were ordered to rotate positions. It was unusual. Rotations happened, yes, but always with notice, always with reason. Today it felt targeted. Thomas was moved from his usual wing to a section much farther away from the royal private rooms, a place where he could see nothing, hear nothing, and learn nothing. Someone wanted him out of the way. He stood rigidly at his new post, pretending nothing bothered him. Guards were trained to be pillars of discipline, masks of control. But behind his stoic expression, his mind raced. Why now? Why him? What had they detected? The answer appeared within the hour. Sarah Alding, Camilla's advisor, passed through the corridor. She slowed, just enough to let her gaze linger on him, studying him as if he were a piece of furniture out of place. Then she smiled, a tight, chilling smile that never reached her eyes. She knew, maybe not everything, but enough to consider him a threat. Thomas inhaled through his nose, exhaled slowly. He couldn't confront her. He couldn't ask questions outright. He wasn't even supposed to acknowledge her unless spoken to. But one thing was clear. Camilla's circle wasn't just plotting something. They were actively protecting it. And now, they were watching him as much as he was watching them. Hours later, during a break in the mess hall, he sat with a few fellow guards. Conversation buzzed around him. Jokes, stories, the usual banter. But Thomas wasn't really listening. His ears caught bits of another conversation 2 tables away. Have you heard? Camilla called a private meeting tonight. Late. Very late. With who? No idea. But security was told not to approach the West Study after 10. The West Study. A room that hadn't been used regularly in months. A room close to the genealogical office Camilla had been sneaking into. A spark ran up Thomas's spine. Whatever she was planning, tonight might be the moment it moved from whisper to action. He needed a plan, not reckless, not impulsive, precise. When night fell, Thomas requested to check the grounds before the shift change. It wasn't suspicious. Guards did it all the time. But instead of heading toward the courtyard, he slipped into a service staircase leading upward, moving carefully, quietly. He avoided the main halls, too exposed, and instead navigated through low-lit back corridors that only long-time guards knew by heart. The West Study sat at the end of the corridor like a darkened eye. A single lamp glowed under the door. He could hear voices. Camilla's voice, sharper than usual, almost strained. You're telling me the signatures won't hold unless Charles reviews it personally? Another voice, male, firm. He has to approve the changes. Without his seal, it means nothing. She sighed deeply. Fine. Bring it to him first thing in the morning. And make sure. A sudden pause. Footsteps. Thomas pressed himself into the shadowed alcove beside an ornamental pillar as the door cracked open. Sarah Alding stepped out first, scanning the hallway. For a moment, Thomas feared she would see him. But he knew how to disappear, how to control his breath so even a candle flame wouldn't flicker. Sarah turned back toward Camilla. We're clear. Clear. Thomas's jaw tightened. They were expecting someone. Expecting danger. Why? Camilla stepped into the light. Her expression was carved from frustration. She clutched the folder so tightly the edges bent. If this goes wrong, she muttered, they'll blame me for everything. They always do. Sarah replied quietly. Once these amendments are accepted, no one can question your position again. Amendments again. To what? The line? The titles? The succession? Thomas had enough fragments now to form a picture, but not enough to expose it. And exposing anything without evidence would destroy him. The monarchy did not forgive accusations made without proof. He had to get closer. He waited until they disappeared around the corner, then slipped out of the alcove and approached the door of the West Study. It was locked now. Of course it was. But the gap under the doorway offered a sliver of information. Faint footprints in the dust, impressions on the table leg, a faint scent of old paper. More importantly, he saw what they had left behind. A single page, just barely sticking out from under the rug. He crouched, heart pounding, aware that any wrong movement could cost him everything. He lifted the rug corner by a few centimeters, no more, and looked. It was a photocopied form, half-finished, perhaps discarded in a rush. But the title stunned him. Proposed adjustment to line of succession, preliminary draft. His breath froze. There it was. Proof. Not rumor. Not palace whisper. Not speculation. A document proposing changes to the succession. His eyes scanned the footnotes, but the details were obscured, half erased, smeared from being stepped on. He saw phrases like review authority, conditional recognition, and priority of inheritance. But without the full document, the meaning was incomplete. Still, this alone showed intent, a direction, a motive. He slipped the page under his belt, hidden beneath his uniform, and stood quickly when he sensed presence approaching. 2 staff members walked by, chatting casually, unaware that Thomas was standing only breaths away from revelation. But the night wasn't over. As he made his way to the lower floors, he sensed movement behind him, light steps, too light for a guard, too purposeful for a tourist. He turned the corner and froze. Sarah Alding stood at the end of the hall, her expression unreadable. "Long night, Officer Hale?" she asked, her voice polite, too polite. "Yes, ma'am," he replied calmly. "Routine rounds." Her gaze drifted down his uniform, as if searching for something. Then she stepped closer. "Be careful where you wander," she said softly. "Some doors are locked for a reason. A warning, a threat, or both." She passed him, her perfume lingering in the cold air like smoke. Thomas waited until her footsteps faded before he exhaled. He could feel the document press against his body, the paper that might hold the truth, or at least a piece of it. He wasn't imagining it anymore. He wasn't overthinking it. He wasn't paranoid. He had seen too much. And now, they knew he had. Thomas barely slept that night. The photocopied draft lay hidden inside a plain folder at the bottom of his locker, tucked beneath spare gloves and a folded uniform shirt. He had read it again before sunrise, every line, every faint mark, every confusing half-erased sentence. It wasn't complete, but it was enough to scare him. The phrase, proposed adjustment to line of succession, echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. If the intentions behind it became reality, the monarchy would not simply shift. It would fracture, and fractures in a royal family did not stay private for long. They bled into the public, into headlines, into national trust. He knew he couldn't handle this alone anymore. But the moment he walked into the palace that morning, he sensed something had changed. 2 guards he didn't recognize stood near the main entrance. New faces, new placements. Their eyes followed him as he passed, not aggressively, but deliberately, like they had been told who he was, like they had been briefed. Thomas kept his posture strong and his pace steady. He needed an ally, someone inside the system, someone with authority, someone who cared more about truth than politics. And there was only one person he trusted enough to approach. Captain Rowan Kerr, head of internal security, a man whose loyalty was to the crown itself, not to individuals. Rowan had served during some of the most turbulent royal years. He'd seen scandals rise and fall, secrets buried and unearthed. He was steady, calm, the kind of man who measured actions in millimeters, not leaps. Thomas waited until midday to approach him, timing it between Rowan's briefings. The captain emerged from a meeting room with a tablet tucked under his arm, his expression tired but focused. Thomas stepped forward. "Sir, do you have a moment?" Rowan paused, studying him. "Make it quick." Thomas lowered his voice. "It's about something I observed regarding the West study." Rowan's posture tightened. He seemed to understand something in that single sentence. "Walk with me," he said. They moved down a quiet corridor, the type lined with portraits of past monarchs, faces that watched silently, as if judging the living. "What exactly did you observe?" Rowan asked without turning his head. Thomas took a slow breath. Unauthorized meetings, restricted documents, Camilla's team using areas tied to genealogical records. Rowan stopped walking. "Are you accusing them of misconduct?" Thomas hesitated. "I'm saying something is happening, sir. Something that could endanger the succession." Rowan's eyes narrowed. Not angry, more like calculating. This is serious, Hale. Very serious. If you're mistaken—" "I'm not, sir." Thomas reached into his jacket. "I have this." He handed Rowan the creased photocopy. The captain unfolded it, scanning each word carefully. His expression changed, not dramatically but subtly. His jaw tightened. His brow lowered. He read it twice before speaking. "Where did you find this?" "In the West study last night. Left under the rug." Rowan folded it again. "You shouldn't have taken it." "I know," Thomas admitted. But leaving it there felt wrong. Another moment of silence passed between them. Finally, Rowan said, "If this draft is real, and it looks real, then we're dealing with an internal alteration to the statutory structure of succession. That's not just improper. It's illegal without parliamentary handling." Thomas felt the floor shift under his feet. "So what now?" Rowan tucked the document inside his coat. Now I investigate properly. But that means you keep your distance. No more sneaking into restricted areas. No more conversations that can make you a target. Target. The word hit hard. "Do they know I saw something?" Thomas asked. Rowan sighed. "I think they suspect you've seen too much, which means you need to be careful." Thomas nodded, but unease gnawed at him. "Sir, you'll tell the right people?" Rowan's reply was steady. "My loyalty is to Crown. Always." It should have reassured Thomas. But something felt off. A tension in Rowan's voice. A heaviness behind his eyes. Still, Thomas followed orders. He returned to routine duties, silent, composed, blending into his post. But the palace didn't relax around him. If anything, the pressure grew thicker. That afternoon, he was reassigned again, this time to the North Hall, the farthest point from the private apartments. The new schedule was slipped into his hands without explanation. He felt boxed in, moved like a chess piece, controlled. As evening fell, whispers circulated that Charles had retired early due to unexpected fatigue. A vague statement, too vague, and the timing made Thomas's heart race. If Camilla's team needed Charles to sign something urgently, was he isolated? Was someone restricting access to him? He needed to know. He needed to confirm Rowan was truly on his side. So when his shift ended, he headed toward Rowan's office, a move he knew carried risk. The palace had never felt so quiet. Not even during late-night state meetings or winter storms did Kensington carry this kind of stillness, the kind that creeps under doors, presses against your chest, and whispers that something is about to change forever. Royal Guard Thomas Hale stood alone in the dim corridor, his gloved hand steady, his heartbeat anything but. Hours earlier, he had risked everything: career, home, reputation, even the oath he had sworn, to reveal the truth that had been buried under polite smiles and ceremonial bows. A plot inside the palace, a betrayal woven into soft words and silk gloves, a threat that reached all the way to the future heirs of the crown. And at the center of it all, Camilla. Thomas never wanted to believe it. For years, he had watched her glide through rooms with the elegance of someone born for the spotlight. But beneath the charm, beneath the polished smiles and the carefully timed comments, something darker had been growing. Something that finally snapped into full focus when he overheard the conversation near the state library, the one that chilled him to the bone. Now, everything depended on what would happen inside this final room. He adjusted his stance as Prince William stepped through the door. The prince looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from carrying too many years of responsibility on shoulders that never asked for sympathy. Behind him, Princess Catherine followed with a calmness Thomas envied. Her expression was steady, but her eyes were fierce, the eyes of a mother who had heard that her children had been placed in harm's way. William motioned Thomas to enter. The guard obeyed. Inside the private meeting hall, King Charles stood near the long table. His posture was rigid, his jaw clenched, his breath tight. The anger wasn't explosive. It was controlled, precise, sharpened by the weight of decades under the scrutiny of crowns and cameras. If William's exhaustion was emotional, Charles's was historical. Thomas bowed. "Your Majesties, your Royal Highness." "Raise your head," Charles ordered, voice low but steady. "Tonight, there is no ceremony, only truth." Thomas lifted his gaze. William spoke first. "You say the threat came from inside the household, that it involved manipulation, influence, and targeted pressure toward our children, toward the future of a monarchy." He paused, looking Thomas squarely in the eyes. "Are you prepared to repeat everything, word for word?" Thomas inhaled. "Yes, sir." And so he did. Every whisper he heard, every document he saw, every moment where a harmless suggestion from Camilla suddenly looked like an attempt to shift control, rearrange influence, and isolate the young heirs from their parents. It wasn't treason. It wasn't a coup. But it was a quiet scheme aimed to tilt the future, a web of subtle positioning and private influence that, if left unchecked, would have changed the course of the bloodline. By the time Thomas finished, the room felt colder. Catherine's voice broke the silence. And the children? She wanted access without us. She wanted influence through the staff. Thomas nodded. "Yes, ma'am." For the first time, the princess looked truly shaken. Not scared, but furious. The kind of fury mothers carry in their bones when their children are threatened. William clenched his jaw. "And she pressured the security rotation?" "Yes, sir." She argued the children didn't need as many guards, that they needed more freedom. But her timing matched the other decisions she was influencing. It wasn't a coincidence. Charles closed his eyes. A long breath escaped him. I should have seen it. This was the moment Thomas feared most, watching a father realize a storm had been forming behind his back. But Charles didn't crumble. He didn't lash out. He didn't hide. He straightened his posture with a calm ferocity only a king could possess. "Bring her in," Charles ordered. The door opened. Camilla stepped inside. She was elegant as always, pearls shining, gown perfectly fitted, expression poised. But when she saw the faces around the table, something flickered under the mask. Annoyance? Fear? Or simply irritation that her quiet influence had been dragged into the light. "Charles," she said smoothly, "I wasn't told what this was about." "You know perfectly well," he answered, voice sharper than Thomas had ever heard. "There will be no games. Not tonight." Her smile tightened. "Is this about the guard again? His accusations?" William leaned forward. "These are not accusations. These are documented actions. Conversations he witnessed. Decisions you pushed for. Patterns you created." Catherine added quietly, "And choices that endangered our children." Camilla's gaze flicked to Thomas, like a needle dipped in ice. The guard misunderstood. "No," Charles cut in. "He did not." For a moment, the queen consort said nothing. Then she exhaled slowly, calculating. "You all assume malice where there was none. But the impact remains," William replied. "Whatever your intention, you crossed boundaries. You interfered with our children. You bypassed us. And you moved to the palace as if the future heirs were pawns in a political game." Camilla's expression tightened. The faintest crack in a wall that had stood for decades. Charles took a step closer. "This family has survived wars, scandals, losses, and lies. But I will not allow division inside my own home. I will not permit manipulation of the next generation." His final words fell like a gavel. Effective immediately, your influence over the children's staff, schedules, and education ends. Permanently. Camilla's breath caught, the first real sign of shock. "And," Charles added, quieter now, "you will step back from certain public duties until trust is rebuilt, if it can be." The room froze. Not a punishment, not exile, but a royal consequence, one that echoed louder than shouting ever could. Camilla stiffened, turned, and walked out with the elegance of someone refusing to break in public, even if the walls were already trembling inside. When the door closed, Charles sank into the nearest chair. Not defeated, relieved. William approached Thomas. "You protected this family. You protected our children. And you did it knowing the risk." Catherine stepped beside her husband. "We owe you more than thanks." But Thomas shook his head. "I'll only follow my duty, ma'am." "No," William said softly. "You followed your conscience. And sometimes that is harder." Thomas swallowed the emotion tightening his throat. As he stepped back into the corridor, dawn light began breaking across the palace windows. A new day, A new chapter in the royal story, one shaped not by whispers but by truth. For the first time in weeks, the palace no longer felt dangerous. And Thomas Hale, the guard who once stood in the shadows, walked forward knowing he had changed the course of a bloodline. The monarchy had survived the scheme. The heirs were safe. And the guard who broke the silence would forever remain part of the unseen history that protected a kingdom